The year was 2018, and deep in the heart of the Pacific Northwest, nestled within the sprawling ancient forests of Oregon, lay the Blackwood Mountain Range. Locals knew it for its breathtaking vistas, treacherous trails, and the hushed, almost superstitious tales of what lay hidden in its highest passes. But for a group of 9 seasoned hikers, the Blackwood Pass was simply their next great challenge, a rugged test of endurance and teamwork. Leading the expedition was Sarah Jenkins, a former Army combat medic now driven by a restless energy she couldn't quite shake. Her eyes, sharp and watchful, scanned the winding path ahead. Beside her, Dr. Ethan Vance, a renowned but fiercely skeptical geologist from the University of Washington, meticulously checked his GPS. He was here to debunk the local folklore about strange magnetic anomalies in the pass, a pet project he'd been working on for months. Trailing slightly, their resident thrill-seeker and burgeoning outdoor influencer, Jake the Summit Seeker Peterson, was already live-streaming snippets of the majestic, snow-dusted pines. #BlackwoodBound, folks, he'd shouted into his phone, his voice echoing eerily in the stillness. The group also included Maria Rodriguez, a quiet but incredibly strong mountaineer, Ben Carter, a tech enthusiast who had built their custom communication array, Chloe Davis, an artist hoping to capture the untouched beauty, and 3 more friends, Liam, Noah, and Olivia, all experienced and eager for the adventure. They were a diverse bunch, but united by their love for the wilderness and a thirst for challenges. They'd spent weeks planning, meticulously packing their gear and poring over topographical maps. They knew the risks, sudden blizzards, treacherous crevasses, and the sheer isolation of the higher elevations. What they didn't account for, however, was the palpable sense of wrongness that began to creep in as they ascended. The first sign was subtle. Around midday on their second day, the usual chatter of forest creatures, the distant caw of a raven, the rustle of squirrels simply stopped. It was as if a giant hand had pressed mute on the wilderness. The silence was so profound it pressed in on their eardrums, almost humming. Ethan, ever the scientist, checked his atmospheric sensors. Nothing unusual. Yet, everyone felt it. A cold, heavy stillness that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Later that afternoon, they stumbled upon something truly unsettling. Half buried in a drift of snow, almost as if deliberately discarded, was an ancient, rusted hiking axe. It looked decades old, perhaps from the early 20th century. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was not its age, but the faint, almost indiscernible carving on its wooden handle. A series of interlocking, irregular symbols that looked less like trail markers and more like a warning. "Anyone recognize this?" she asked, her voice hushed. No one did. Jake, ever the one to lighten the mood, made a joke about finding ancient Bigfoot tools, but the laughter died quickly, swallowed by the oppressive silence. As dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange, they reached their designated campsite for the night, a relatively flat clearing at the foot of Blackwood Pass itself. The wind began to pick up, not a gentle breeze, but a sudden, violent gust that seemed to materialize from nowhere, howling like a banshee through the skeletal trees. It slammed into their exposed tent as they struggled to set it up, threatening to rip the canvas from their hands. Suddenly, Ben's customized radio crackled to life, but it wasn't a weather update or a check-in from base camp. It was a cacophony of distorted static interspersed with what sounded like human screams. Not just one, but multiple, overlapping cries, twisted and stretched by the interference, yet undeniably terrifying. Ethan scrambled to adjust the frequency, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the relentless howl of the wind and the pounding of their own hearts. "What in God's name was that?" Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with fear, staring out into the encroaching darkness. Sarah gripped the axe, the strange symbols feeling colder than the metal itself. They were no longer just hikers seeking a challenge. They were guests in a place that clearly did not want them there, a place with secrets far older and darker than any of them could comprehend. The true ascent, they realized, had only just begun. All right, we've set the stage with a chilling start in Chapter 1. Now, we're building the tension, introducing the paranoia, and leading directly into the infamous cut tent incident, all while deepening the mystery and the sense of encroaching horror. The night at Blackwood Pass descended like a shroud, thick and suffocating. After the disturbing radio incident, sleep was a luxury none of them could truly afford. Inside their large, shared expedition tent, the air crackled with unspoken fear. Every creak of the straining canvas, every moan of the wind outside, seemed to morph into something else. A distant whisper, a dragging sound, the faint thump-thump of something heavy moving through the snow. Ethan, the scientist, tried to rationalize it away. It's just the wind, atmospheric interference, our minds playing tricks in a stressful situation. But even his voice lacked conviction, a subtle tremor betraying his unease. Sarah, ever vigilant, kept her hand on the old hiking axe she'd found, the strange symbols on its handle now seeming to throb with a sinister energy in the dim glow of their headlamps. Around midnight, Jake, who had been trying to lighten the mood with old campfire stories, suddenly went rigid. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a raw edge of terror. Everyone went silent, straining their ears. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound, rhythmic and persistent, seemed to be coming from just outside the tent. It wasn't an animal, it was too deliberate, too human-like. Ben, the tech expert, fumbled for his night vision binoculars, peering through a small mesh vent. "I don't see anything, but it sounds like someone's trying to dig under the snow right by the entrance." The scratching intensified, a chilling reminder of how vulnerable they were. The ground beneath them felt cold, not just from the frost, but with a creeping, unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from beneath their sleeping bags. Panic began to ripple through the group. Chloe, her face pale, huddled closer to Maria. Liam started mumbling about turning back at first light, a desperate plea. Sarah, always the leader, tried to keep a level head. "It's probably a bear trying to get at our food supply," she stated, though she knew in her gut it wasn't. Bears didn't scratch like that. Bears didn't make the faint, raspy breathing sound that now seemed to join the scratching, just beyond the canvas. Suddenly, a terrifying pressure built against the side of the tent, directly opposite the entrance. It wasn't a push, but a heavy, deliberate lean, like something immense was pressing its weight against the fabric. The tent groaned under the strain, and a faint, acrid smell, like ozone mixed with something metallic and rotten, began to seep in. "Get ready," Sarah commanded, her voice low and urgent, gripping the axe tighter. Ethan fumbled for a flare gun, his scientific detachment crumbling. The scratching stopped abruptly. The heavy pressure vanished. Then, with a sound like a tearing scream, the tent fabric near the entrance ripped. Not a small tear, but a long, violent slash, as if something with impossible claws had just raked its way through. A blast of frigid, unholy wind roared into the tent, extinguishing their headlamps and plunging them into absolute darkness. Confusion, then sheer, unadulterated terror erupted. The air was filled with screams, the scrambling sounds of bodies trying to move, and the terrifying, deafening rush of the wind through the massive tier. No one saw what did it, only felt the chilling void where the tent wall used to be, now open to the terrifying unknown outside. In the chaos, Jake, scrambling for his camera, swore he saw it, a tall, gaunt shadow, impossibly thin against the swirling snow, disappearing into the blizzard. But before he could even process the image, a powerful, unseen force slammed into the back of the tent, throwing everyone forward, sending them sprawling into the snow-covered ground outside. Disoriented, freezing, and utterly terrified, the hikers were no longer safe within their camp. Something had been outside, something had forced its way in, and now they were exposed, scattered, and utterly alone in the chilling heart of Blackwood Pass. The real horror had just begun. All right, Chapter 2 left our hikers scattered and exposed. Now we're diving into the frantic scattering, the initial terrifying discoveries, and the horrifying realization that they're being hunted, all while maintaining that escalating dread. The sudden, brutal force that ripped through their tent and threw them into the blizzard was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It wasn't the impact of an animal or a rock slide. It felt deliberate, precise, and utterly malevolent. Disoriented and gasping in the frigid air, the hikers scrambled in every direction, the howling wind and blinding snow making it impossible to see or hear each other. Sarah, the former medic, was the first to regain some composure, her military training kicking in despite the sheer terror. "Everyone, stay together! Call out!" she yelled, her voice immediately swallowed by the gale. She could hear frantic shouts and terrified whimpers, but they were fading, swallowed by the storm. She reached for the old hiking axe, its carved symbols now feeling like a branding iron in her numb hand. There was no time to question what had just happened, only instinct to survive. Ethan, the skeptical scientist, found himself tangled in a coil of rope, his headlamp lost in the snow. He heard a gut-wrenching scream, sharp and undeniably human, cut short by a sickening crunch that resonated even over the storm. It was close, too close. He fumbled blindly, his scientific mind screaming for answers that simply weren't there. This wasn't logical. This wasn't natural. The blizzard became a chaotic, swirling vortex of white, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. Each gust of wind seemed to carry distorted whispers, mocking laughter, or the faintest hint of that awful, metallic, rotten smell they'd detected earlier. The snow wasn't just falling. It felt like it was pushing them, driving them down the mountain, away from the camp, away from any semblance of safety. Hours later, though it felt like an eternity, the blizzard began to relent, softening to a thick, chilling mist. Sarah, bruised and shivering, stumbled down a steep embankment. That's when she saw it. Half buried in a fresh snowdrift, just off what would have been their emergency descent path, was Jake, the summit seeker Peterson. He was lying face down, his backpack still strapped to him, but something was terribly, horrifically wrong. As Sarah cautiously approached, she saw that his body was contorted at an unnatural angle, his limbs bent in ways they simply shouldn't be. When she gently rolled him over, a gasp of pure horror escaped her lips. Jake's face was frozen in a mask of ultimate terror. His eyes, wide and vacant, stared up at the swirling mist. But it was his skull that sent a jolt of ice through Sarah's veins. It was caved in on one side, a massive, unnatural indentation, as if he'd been struck by something with impossible force. There were no marks of a fall, no signs of animal attack, just that grotesque, blunt force trauma. And strangely, despite the freezing temperatures, a faint, unnatural warmth seemed to emanate from the wound, a bizarre thermal anomaly in the biting cold. Sarah fought the urge to vomit. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an animal. Something had done this to Jake, and it was still out there. A few yards away through the thinning mist, she spotted another figure. It was Chloe. Chloe was kneeling in the snow, facing away from Sarah, her shoulders shaking violently. Sarah called out her name, relief momentarily overriding her dread, but Chloe didn't respond. As Sarah drew closer, she saw that Chloe was rocking back and forth, muttering incoherently. When Chloe slowly turned, Sarah recoiled. Chloe's eyes were wide and unfocused, filled with a primal, animalistic terror. Her hands, raw and bleeding, were desperately clawing at the frozen ground, as if trying to bury something or uncover it. Her lips were blue with cold, but they were also moving in a silent, frantic monologue. And then Sarah saw it, a small, dark object clutched in Chloe's hand, half buried in the snow she was clawing at. It was Ben's customized communication array, smashed beyond recognition, its wires twisted into strange, almost symbolic knots. Chloe suddenly let out a piercing, unearthly shriek, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the mountain silence. She pointed a trembling, frost-bitten finger deeper into the mist, her eyes fixed on something Sarah couldn't see. It's watching, Chloe whimpered, her voice raspy. It's still, feeding. Before Sarah could react, a sudden violent gust of wind, stronger and colder than any before, ripped through the pass. It wasn't natural. It was a focused, malevolent burst of air, carrying with it that sickening ozone and rot stench. Chloe's eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed lifelessly into the snow. The communication array slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft thud. Sarah was now truly alone, standing over two dead friends, one gruesomely battered, the other terrified to death. And she knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever had stalked them in the darkness of Blackwood Pass was far from finished. It had only just begun its hunt. The air itself felt poisoned. Sarah knelt beside Chloe and Jake, the unnatural stillness of their forms, a stark contrast to the terror that still pulsed through the very core of Blackwood Pass. It wasn't just the cold that numbed her. It was the sheer, impossible horror of what had transpired. This wasn't a rogue animal, a natural disaster, or a deranged human. This was something else entirely. With the first light of a bleak dawn, the full extent of the tragedy began to reveal itself. Sarah, driven by a grim determination, spent agonizing hours searching, following fragmented tracks in the melting snow, calling out names that were only answered by the mournful echo of the wind. She found Liam first. He was sprawled face down near a cluster of jagged rocks, his body showing no overt signs of struggle or blunt force trauma. Yet, when Sarah carefully turned him over, she gasped, a choked cry escaping her lips. Liam's eyes were gone, not torn out by an animal or pecked by birds. They were simply missing, as if scooped clean from their sockets by an impossibly precise instrument. The skin around the empty hollows was pristine, undisturbed. It was as if something had meticulously extracted them, a chilling, almost ritualistic precision. Sarah backed away, trembling. This wasn't about killing, it was about something far more disturbing, something ancient and predatory. She continued her desperate search. The image of Liam's vacant stare burned into her mind. Hours later, guided by a faint metallic tang on the frigid air, she stumbled upon Noah and Olivia, tragically found together in a shallow crevice, their bodies entangled. They too showed the same lack of external struggle, no broken bones or signs of a fight. But when Sarah reached them, she immediately noticed the horrific commonality: their mouths. Both Noah and Olivia's tongues had been precisely removed. Again, no tearing, no messy bloodbath. It was as if a surgeon, with an inhuman hand, had meticulously excised them. The sight sent a wave of nausea through Sarah, so intense it made her dizzy. What kind of entity did this? What purpose did it serve to steal eyes and tongues? Was it preventing them from seeing something or from speaking about it? The old legends of the mountain, dismissed by Ethan, now screamed in her mind, tales of ancient spirits, of a watcher that demanded tribute, of a silencer that stole voices. Then she found Maria. Maria was still alive, barely. She was huddled against a snow-covered pine, shivering violently, her eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on something Sarah couldn't see. Maria was humming, a low, discordant tune that grated on Sarah's nerves. When Sarah approached, Maria flinched, then looked at her with an eerie, unnerving smile. It wants them," Maria whispered, her voice raspy, her breath fogging in the cold air. The eyes, to see the true face, the tongues, to tell its stories. Maria suddenly began to babble, a torrent of words pouring out, describing impossible creatures, swirling shadows, and a deep, humming sound that came from beneath the earth itself. Her sanity had clearly fractured, shattered by whatever horrors she had witnessed. She scratched frantically at her own scalp, drawing blood, as if trying to tear something out of her own mind. Sarah tried to help Maria, to warm her, but Maria thrashed, her strength seemingly amplified by her terror. "It's inside!" Maria shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the deepest part of Blackwood Pass. "It's ancient, and it's waking." As Maria screamed, the temperature around them plummeted even further, frost blooming instantly on their eyelashes. A faint, low hum seemed to emanate from the ground itself, growing steadily louder, a vibrational hum that resonated deep in Sarah's bones. Before Sarah could react, Maria's body went rigid, her eyes suddenly clearing for a split second, filled with a look of profound, agonizing understanding. Then, with a convulsion that seemed to shake the very ground, Maria collapsed, lifeless, her face contorted in a final, silent scream. The humming stopped, the cold eased slightly. Sarah stood there, alone, surrounded by the horrific tableau of her friends. Jake, with his crushed skull. Chloe, terrified to death beside a destroyed communicator. Liam, eyeless. Noah and Olivia, tongueless. And now Maria, driven to madness, then death, by something that seemed to steal parts of them for an unknown, sinister purpose. The cold was secondary now. It was the absolute, unadulterated dread that froze her to the core. Whatever ancient malevolence resided in Blackwood Pass, it was not merely killing them, it was consuming them, piece by horrifying piece. And Sarah was the only one left. When the search and rescue teams finally reached Blackwood Pass, days after the emergency beacon was activated, presumably by Ben before his demise, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The shredded remnants of an expedition tent, scattered gear, and a horrifying tableau of 9 frozen bodies. Among them, miraculously, was Sarah Jenkins, barely clinging to life, suffering from severe hypothermia, frostbite, and a profound, unshakable trauma that seemed to have hollowed her out from the inside. The official investigation that followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic obfuscation. Local authorities, backed by state and federal agencies, struggled to reconcile the evidence. The initial reports floated theories of extreme weather, a rare avalanche, or even a bear attack, despite the glaring inconsistencies. How did a blizzard precisely slash open a tent from the inside? How did blunt force trauma occur with no sign of a struggle or impact? And most disturbingly, how did victims end up miles apart, some with grotesque surgical-like mutilations, missing eyes, severed tongues, that defied any natural explanation? Dr. Ethan Vance's body was eventually recovered, far from the initial campsite, his face frozen in a rictus of pure terror, but showing no signs of the specific mutilations that plagued his friends. His meticulously organized field notes, however, were found intact. They contained increasingly frantic entries about unexplained magnetic anomalies, subterranean vibrations, and chilling sketches of the same irregular symbols Sarah had seen on the old hiking axe. His last entry simply read, "It's not magnetic, it's sentient, and it saw us." These notes were quickly dismissed as delirious ravings caused by hypothermia by the lead investigator, a stoic state trooper named Captain Miller, who looked haunted by the entire case. Captain Miller himself, despite public pronouncements of a tragic weather-related incident, reportedly closed the case with a personal note filed away. Unexplained energy readings, unidentifiable biological residue at scene, mutilations consistent with no known predator, recommend indefinite closure, further investigation deemed detrimental to public safety and morale. Rumors persist that Miller transferred out of the Mountain Patrol unit shortly after, never quite the same. What truly happened on Blackwood Pass that fateful winter remains shrouded in a fog as dense as the blizzards that sweep through its peaks. Sarah Jenkins, the lone survivor, spent years in therapy, her memories fragmented by the trauma. She rarely spoke of the incident, but when she did, her eyes would fill with a chilling, distant terror. She often drew circles on paper, then scratched them out, and sometimes she'd whisper, "It wasn't the cold, it was the waiting." Old Man Hemlock, a reclusive prospector who lived at the base of Blackwood Mountain for decades, was interviewed by a local newspaper a year after the incident. He just shook his head, his ancient eyes filled with a knowing sorrow. "Always knew that pass was hungry," he rasped. "The old ones, they called it the place where silence steals the breath. You disturb what's buried there and it takes its due. Eyes to see its ugliness, tongues to tell its ancient truths." His words were largely ignored, dismissed as the ramblings of a superstitious hermit. But for those who delve into the strange, the dark, and the mysterious, the Blackwood Pass incident remains one of America's most chilling and perplexing unsolved cases. Was it truly just a terrible accident exacerbated by extreme weather? Or did the 9 hikers of Blackwood Pass stumble upon something ancient, something malevolent, that lay dormant beneath the snowy peaks? Something that didn't just kill them, but consumed parts of them for an unspeakable purpose? The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes those secrets are not just hidden, they are hungry. Blackwood Pass still stands, its dark, forested slopes silently watching, waiting for the next group of adventurers to stray too far, to dig too deep to disturb what lies beneath. And the question remains, what did those hikers see that cost them their eyes? And what terrifying truth did they hear that cost them their tongues? The pass is still out there, and so perhaps is it.